Welcome back to Washington Journal. For about the next 40 minutes, we're joined by Linda Lear, who is...
Good morning.
Thank you very much for coming in. She's a biographer, among other things, the biographer of Rachel Carson. And if you were to describe Rachel Carson to somebody who might never have heard of her at all, or who might know vaguely who she is, how would you describe Rachel Carson?
Carson was a scientist and an environmentalist who loved nature and wanted to share that love with the public by writing about it, but also became alarmed that we had overstepped our bounds as human beings and were harming ourselves and the environment irrevocably, and wanted to warn us about that.
Okay. And I know that you think, she's obviously the author of 4 books.
4 books.
And it's the view of many, including yourself, I think that some of the early books are quite good as well, and
right.
maybe even better. But the one that she's best known for, and I know I'm going to try to put this under the RoboCam here and show our audience the Silent Spring, which
right.
is the book that probably made her reputation for the ages.
It did. And
can you explain, first of all, what led up to the writing of this book and what the impact of the book was?
Well, the agricultural chemical companies were big business after World War II, and DDT had been invented and created and used widely during the war, very successfully against insect pests. But after the war, it became commonly used in agriculture to kill all manner of pests, sprayed by airplane without anybody's permission over vast areas of America. And Carson became concerned that evidence was showing her that wildlife was dying. The Patuxent Refuge, which is right up the road in Laurel, Maryland, had done a lot of work on DDT, and it showed absolutely conclusively that it was very harmful to fish and other wildlife. And they were dying by overuse, what Carson called misuse. She wasn't against pesticides. She was against their misuse and their overuse and their ineffective use. And so she set out to bring this kind of science to the public, to make it understandable. And the book was published in 1962 and caused an incredible ruckus, because here was a woman without very many credentials in the way the world worked, telling us that the government was lying, that science was wrong, and that we should take another look at what we were doing.
We want to invite our callers, our listeners, our viewers to call in. Remind you we have 3 lines. Republicans 202-737-0002. Democrats 202-737-0001. Independents and all others 202-628-0205. I've said that Linda Lear is the biographer of Rachel Carson. Here is that biography. Rachel Carson, A Witness for Nature. Why this picture on the cover?
Well, 2 reasons. One, because Carson was a very romantic, almost mystical person in her spiritual relationship with nature. She was, first of all, a nature writer and a brilliant writer. Or otherwise she couldn't have made such a boring and deadly subject such as DDT palatable to the public as a bestseller. And I chose the picture because it's also by one of her best friends and colleagues here in town, Shirley Briggs, and it sort of typified the mystical sense of Carson's spirituality.
Let's take a look at when you open the book, you talk about her, and I just want to read the first paragraph for our listeners here. Most of all, it was her determination that set her apart. As a child, Rachel Louise Carson decided that she would be a writer. A literary talent, perhaps genius, and a hard-driving intelligence brought her that. But at the base of it, there was a ferocious will. Right.
This was a woman who had a sense very early on in her life that she was meant to do something important. It's rather unusual for us to meet these kinds of people. She was very single-minded, very determined that she wasn't sure exactly what her talent was going to lead her to, but she was confident that she had it, and confident that somehow she'd find out what she was to do with it. And that something that to do with it was science.
Now, originally she thought she would simply be a writer.
Right.
And she published her first short story depending on, I read 2 different ages. One was age 10,
right.
One was age 11. Either one is pretty extraordinary,
right.
But...
Well, there was a wonderful magazine back then that children wrote in, the St. Nicholas magazine, and they had contests and children could write in. And Carson wrote early stories, and they won badges and were actually paid if they won so many badges and reached a certain level. So she published stories, mainly these were stories about her hometown in Springdale, Pennsylvania, and what she was doing out in nature with her mother who was her constant companion and her teacher. And later on, then she wrote, of course, about nature itself, and she was really an acclaimed nature writer.
And at some point, I guess it was in college,
college.
Something shifted.
Right. In college, she found that she was not exactly terribly imaginative, or at least she thought she wasn't, and so that she was better suited, she finally learned, to write about what was at the other end of her microscope. In a biology class, her mind was expanded and she was just turned on, and she decided that here was something to write about.
And did she go on and I guess that she got degrees in science?
She got a master's degree in science from Johns Hopkins.
And then went to
biology.
work?
And then went to Woods Hole, where she first saw the sea for the first time, and then finally got a job. This was during the Depression. She wanted to go on for a doctorate and couldn't financially. Got a job with the Fish and Wildlife Service, or what was then the Biological Survey, and got a job with the Interior Department and Fish and Wildlife.
Yeah, this is somebody who lived inland all her life in western Pennsylvania. I guess Springdale is near Pittsburgh,
right? It's up the river.
Got to the ocean at age 20-something.
Right.
Saw it, and that became a huge influence in her life.
Well, she had always had this passion for the sea, and she lived on the Allegheny River at a particularly wide part of the river, so that I have a feeling that water was in her blood from way off, and that she loved literature about the sea and was very knowledgeable. So when she saw it, it was just a kind of match.
Okay, now there are exhibits and things people can go to see.
That's right.
About her, and I think we have some footage of one, but why don't you talk a little bit about where people can go? And
well, there's a new exhibit at the Department of Interior Museum, main interior, on Carson. It's a small exhibit, but it's a very powerful exhibit, I think, that explains her life and her work, and particularly her some 15 years at the Department of Interior, where she was ended up as editor-in-chief of all Fish and Wildlife publications.
Now, if somebody wants an entry point, of course, your biography is the definitive biography. Let me give you another plug here. It's Rachel Carson, Witness for Nature. It's a big book, but also she has written several books. And
Carson wrote 4 books, that's right. And the most important of her early nature books was a book called The Sea Around Us, which became an enormous bestseller and really put her name in the world, on the world map. It was an attempt to inform the public about all the science of oceanography that had come out during World War II, and to tell them about what was really under the sea.
Now, this sold 200,000 copies. This is extraordinary. It's a book about the sea. Can you pinpoint one thing that made it fascinating to people?
Well, I think anybody who goes to the beach is fascinated by the sea, and when they pick up a shell, you know, what kind of a creature lived there, and those waves, you know, where do they come from and where do they go, and that's what she explained in very, very common but almost poetic terms.
Let's let our callers into this conversation for our first call from Jacksonville, Florida. Good morning.
Yes, I've got a question about Ms. Carson. I think her book about Silent Spring clearly has a great deal of merit, but I think, Ms. Lear, it's sort of disappointing that you would include a preface by a buffoon like Al Gore, who would write, what was his book, Earth
and the Balance?
Earth and Balance, where it clearly depends our entire economy and everything we've got in this country is dependent on essentially redistribution or cash payments to the developing world, and masked in environmental protection, which is based on really bad science, or perhaps not even bad science, but questionable science, as to whether greenhouse gases are actually causing a ozone hole.
Okay, let's get a response. Al Gore wrote that.
Well, I had nothing to do with that preface. Let's put that out first. The preface was contracted by the publisher, Houghton Mifflin, who publishes Silent Spring, and it was the new addition to Silent Spring that they asked him to write the preface. So it was, shall we say, politically timely.
This book sells 25,000 copies a year. Still.
This book still sells 25,000.
First came out in 1962.
That's right, 25,000 copies a year.
There are a lot of authors who would love to sell 25,000 copies at all.
You betcha.
So that's pretty impressive. Here's another book, and I just want to mention this before we go to the next call. Lost Woods, The Discovered Writing of Rachel Carson, which you edited and wrote an introduction for. This is by Beacon Press, published by Beacon Press in Boston, I believe. Right. What's this book about?
This is an attempt to bring some of Carson's unpublished writing to the attention of the public. the 4 books that she wrote, the Under the Sea Wind, The Edge of the Sea Around Us, and a posthumously published Sense of Wonder are available. But a lot of Carson's other writing is just as good, and so I tried to compile some letters, some early childhood writings, some speeches, some papers that she had written that would never see the light of day because they weren't book length, into an edition that gave people a sense of Carson.
If there's a favorite passage you have in there, you know, I want to take another call quickly here, but if there's something you want to read to us, and also why don't we get some of the photos and then we can show those as we're taking another call. If you want to if you hand them to me, I'll put them under here.
Okay.
We got photos of Rachel Carson at various times in her life. How old was she in this picture?
This is like a picture of Carson at the heyday of her time in the 40s at the Fish and Wildlife Service. It's one of the rare pictures that you see of Carson healthy and smiling.
She died
in
She
died in 1964, only 18 months after Silent Spring was published, of misdiagnosed breast cancer.
And she was 56 years old at the time of her death. Let's go ahead. I'm remiss here in not getting some more of our callers in. They're all waiting. Atlanta, Georgia, Republican line, good morning.
Yes, good morning. I am curious if Miss Lear could comment whether Rachel Carson would feel that the trade-off of banning chemicals like DDT and other pesticides that control insects, if the trade-off of millions of people worldwide who die yearly due to things like malaria and things like that, if Rachel Carson would consider that a good trade-off.
That's a very good question, and it's complex indeed. Carson was not against, as I say, it was not against pesticides, and certainly in the third world and in places where malaria is back with a vengeance, it's a chemical that needs to be considered to be used, as do others. I think there is a trade-off. Carson was not an ideologue. She was not someone who would say, we must never do this. She was trying to tell us that as human beings we were out of control in our use of technology to kill things that may not be really pests, but just inconveniences in our lives, and that we ought to just think about what we were doing long-term.
There were some incidents that really led to this, as I discovered in my reading. There was something that happened in Duxbury, Massachusetts. I think.
Well, there were. I think the bird issue gets a lot of people, and back in the 40s and 50s, bird watching was maybe more important than it is now. I'm not sure, but the mosquitoes were. The planes sprayed for mosquitoes in Duxbury, Massachusetts, and one of Carson's literary friends had a sanctuary there, and her birds just died horrible deaths, and she wrote to Carson and said, can't you find someone in Congress to do something about this situation? Then there was a big fire ant plague where the Department of Agriculture was covering the South with hundreds and hundreds of pounds of dieldrin and other very powerful chemicals to kill the fire ant. That was out of control, and so wildlife were dying, and then the Department of Agriculture started covering up the fact that all this wildlife was actually dying from their overuse of a very dangerous chemical.
Our next call, Providence, New Jersey, Democratic line, good morning. Providence, are you there?
Hello, yes.
Hi.
We have a Silent Spring here, and at one time we had wild honeybees that as soon as the first crocus was blooming, there they'd be. Where they came from and where they stayed, it was hard to tell. But now they are not there. We have a small orchard, and 30 years ago, when it would be in bloom, it would be buzzing with activities of all types of bees, and now it's silent. Well,
that's absolutely correct, and bees are one of the lightning rods, if you will, of our pesticide use. So are frogs and amphibians, and there are places that people write to me about the fact that there are no more croaking frogs in their ponds, and where did they go? We have certainly done damage to the universe and to the earth, and we're reaping the repercussions and the change in diversity, the change of species, the alteration of species. No question about it.
You know, there was something that's interesting. She's one of the 100 notable Americans
Right.
in Time magazine. And Time magazine, Peter Matheson, the author, wrote an appreciation of her for the magazine, talking about when Silent Spring was published in 1962 and what the reaction was. She was derided by the chemical industry as an hysterical woman. But even more interesting is that Peter Matheson writes here that Time's own reviewer deplored Carson's, quote, oversimplifications and downright errors. Many of the scary generalizations, and there are lots of them, are patently unsound. It was a
Right.
very, in some quarters, a very hostile reaction to this
Very
book.
hostile. It's interesting to note that on her death in 1964, Time magazine wrote a wonderful laudatory review of Carson and completely changed their opinion of the efficacy of Carson's science. So they did a real double take about face. But the chemical industry was scared to death because they were certain, and they were right, that the housewives of the world were going to stop buying bug bombs and sprays, and their revenues were going to go down, and people were going to start reading labels and questioning what they were doing and with chemicals, and maybe even government regulation would get worse. So they put up a tremendous campaign of $250,000, which in 1962 was an outrageous amount of money, to try to silence and discredit Carson. And of course, they went after her as a woman on gendered terms and tried to make her out as a hysteric alarmist.
But I gather this sort of backfired.
It backfired. It did backfire. One of the reasons it backfired was because President Kennedy took it quite seriously, took the book seriously. It was first published in pre-publication form by The New Yorker in 3 serials, and that made the intelligentsia aware of this book. Kennedy read it in The New Yorker and started some committee investigation about the use of chemicals, and in a press conference even mentioned it. So that gave her quite a legitimate boost up, and all during the time in which this chemical discreditation campaign was going on, the government was working to hold hearings, and in 1963 they did.
Okay, our next call from Madison, Wisconsin. Democratic line, good morning.
Good morning. I'm very pleased that you've written this book, and I want to thank you for the work you've done. It's an enormous amount of work, I'm sure.
Thank you.
I called to comment that I think it's important we celebrate the lives of these people who stand up to the powers that want to silence voices that are looking intelligently at the issues we confront. And certainly we've had this in the past with people like Aldo Leopold, who lived in Madison, and when he was working in this city, he was hung in effigy in northern parts of the state for attempts to bring people to awareness about the biological impacts of large deer herds, for instance. I think I wanted to share with you that a few weeks ago we started a series of Earth Day commissions, and we set the words to music of John Muir, Aldo Leopold, and Gaylord Nelson. And Mr. Nelson sent a foreword. And I think very highly of Rachel Carson, and she's on the short list of authors whose words we intend to have set in some way for an Earth Day Commission in the coming 2 to 3 years.
Well, good. Just don't make her an icon, because she was a real live person who cared deeply about the Earth.
Here's a cartoon from The New Yorker, I think. No, Saturday Review. This shows how much she'd sort of penetrated the culture. There's a man at a bar complaining to the bartender, and I don't know if we can even read it here, but here's the caption. I had just come to terms with fallout, and along comes Rachel Carson.
Right. That's a very interesting cartoon, because the background to the whole DDT controversy was radioactive fallout, and the public during the 40s and 50s, of course, was very familiar with the way fallout worked, the silence of it, the fact that it penetrated bodies, that it got into your bones, that you didn't have to swallow it, eat it, or do anything else, that it was there. And Carson used that knowledge very directly in Silent Spring. The first chemical that she mentions in the book is not DDT, but it's a radioactive element, strontium-90. And she, throughout the book, talks about the silent killer and the fact that there is silence in the spring.
Here's another cartoon here. It's a praying mantis praying, and it says, God bless Mama and Papa and Rachel Carson. Where did that run somewhere in a magazine? Or?
Yeah, it was. I think that was also in the Saturday Review. I'm not really sure. We couldn't find a source, but the insects of the world had a right to be grateful to Carson in the sense that she cared about all of life, and she was trying to tell us that we are interconnected. So what we're doing to the natural world, we're also doing to ourselves.
Jackson, Mississippi, Republican line, good morning.
Yes, I was in Italy during the Second World War when DDT was used to wipe out a typhus epidemic. A lot of soldiers were killed during the First World War because of typhus. I have one question. Does this white Caucasian American believe that seeing the bald eagle is better than the million lives that are lost to malaria in non-white third world countries?
Thanks.
I don't think so. I don't think that's the opposition or what she was trying to talk about.
Are there ways to control mosquito populations now that are as effective as DDT?
There are. Well, I'm not the scientist, so I can't speak to exactly what chemicals are out there now. But in third world populations, the cheapest chemical is still DDT. There's no question about it.
Okay, and it's still widely used?
It's still widely used. I think we should point out that though DDT was banned for production in the United States in the early 70s, it has been exported around the world by the United States ever since. It was only banned for domestic production and use.
But
it's widely used.
It is still manufactured in the United States, but it's got to be exported.
It's exported, right.
Okay. Elton, Maryland, calling on the independent line. Good morning.
Yes, hi. One of the things that I've noticed is there in this area there's a complete lack of wild honeybees. I think that I read that 90% of the population of the wild honeybees have disappeared, and I'm a gardener, and I'm noticing that there simply are no wild honeybees. Also, one of the things that we're seeing is a complete disappearance of amphibians worldwide, and I'm very alarmed because I see these as being the canary in the coal mine type of signs. And also around the world we're seeing a very high cancer rate, and this is something that Rachel Carson tried to address in her book, and I would just like to hear your comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, another caller mentioned the honeybee, and there are certainly canaries warning signals here, but I think it's wider than the amphibians or the canaries. It's a change in what wildlife is able to survive, not only because of chemicals, but because of invasions to their habitats and so forth. The Earth is changing, the climate is changing, the Earth is changing, and what we've done to it is clearly to make the mix of chemicals that we've put in the air and the water and on the land quite a melange of chemical soup, and no one is really sure exactly what that means long term.
Staten Island, New York, Democratic line, good morning.
Good morning. Let me just turn down the sound.
Sure. Just want to remind everybody when you get ready to go on the air, and of course I'm going to surprise you when that happens, but just have your mute button ready.
My question is I have a question and a comment. The question is, where or how did Rachel Carson research the information about the chemicals and the chemical companies that went into Silent Spring? That's my question. And my comment is, I now have a silent backyard in the middle of Staten Island, New York City, since they've been spraying for the West Nile virus here. My carpenter bees, whom I really don't like, I finally got rid of them with the spraying for the West Nile virus. But I enjoyed seeing them, and they were there for 20 years until last summer.
Interesting.
Thank you.
I'll hang up and listen.
Okay.
Carson was not a field researcher, either for The Sea Around Us or for any of her books. Her great talent was as a synthesizer. And what she did, of course, was to ferret out information about that the chemical companies, the wildlife science, cancer science had for some time, and put it together in Silent Spring. And her bibliography is quite rich in that book. She gives a long bibliography of what she's used. She followed a certain line of independent inquiry in Silent Spring that linked cancers, certain kinds of cancers, to pesticides and the use of pesticides. That's certainly been borne out, but she didn't and wasn't able to investigate all the lines that now are open, and people such as Theo Colburn have been able to research recently.
I want to point out that the New York University Department of Journalism picked the top 100 works of journalism in the United States in the 20th century, and Silent Spring is number 2 behind only Hiroshima, John Hersey's book that was actually first printed again, just like Silent Spring, in the New Yorker.
There's no question that Carson changed the way, she's a revolutionary because she changed the way we look at the earth and at our relationship with the world. Before Rachel Carson, we were content to think that human beings were really in control.
Luther, Montana, Republican line. Good morning.
Good morning. Good show. First time got on. My heart's in my throat.
Welcome, welcome.
Since Rachel Carson's book did a good thing, I'm sure, for our environment. Brought a lot of people to life. However, I live in the West since my military days and before. And I see all kinds of things that are restricting life in the West. The Eastern establishment dictates our tree cutting. The Forest Service people can't even put in a bid for some tree cutting, which might help allay some of the fires that we have every season and that we're getting prepared for now. It's not worth the money that the lawsuits that the tree huggers put forth. They don't do it anymore. I don't know what's going to happen, but I live right near the forest, so I'm an environmentalist once I've got my house in the forest. The developers are the bad guys.
Okay, caller, thanks. Why don't we go to Madison, Connecticut, Independent line. Good morning.
Good morning.
Go right ahead, caller.
I was wondering, I happen to be a devotee of conservationism, and I wondered whether anybody had heard the program the other night with Mr. Moyers on, where he had a doctor that had done tests, I believe, on Mr. Moyers' blood, and he found 83 different kind of chemicals in the blood that are from pesticides, all the different things that we use in the environment. And Mr. Moyers asked whether that would have been in his blood 60 years ago. Would it have been in people's blood 60 years ago? And the doctor said no. So that we very definitely are, getting to the point where we're making ourselves sick.
That's right. And that was Carson's point, that we don't know the long-term outcome of what we're doing to the earth, and what we're doing to ourselves is the same thing that we're doing to the earth.
I want to remind viewers, listeners, tomorrow, C-SPAN, Washington Journal on Sunday, Gary Bauer, former Republican presidential candidate, now with Campaign for Working Families, Laura March with the American Civil Liberties Union, and Jeffrey Bell, a Republican political consultant. And I'd also like to read just something here. This is some of Rachel Carson's own writing. This is again in this Appreciation in Time, which I went and found on their website, which is pretty good. The beauty of the living world I was trying to save, she wrote in a letter to a friend in 1962, has always been uppermost in my mind. That and anger at the senseless, brutish things that were being done. I have felt bound by a solemn obligation to do what I could. If I didn't at least try, I could never be happy again in nature. But now I can believe that I have at least helped a little. It would be unrealistic to believe one book could bring a complete change.
That's a wonderful quote, and it's at the end. It comes at the end of Silent Spring, where she also talks about what she was trying to do with her work and her life. And this particular letter to her friend was to suggest that while Carson knew she was dying by this time, she certainly didn't think one book would make a difference. But in fact, one book did make a difference. And the hearings that she testified at made a difference and began our current concern with clean water and clean air. And it took a long time, but we finally got to where we can't say that we don't know what we're doing. That's the big change. Whatever it is that we're doing, we also know that we are spraying our lawns, we are pouring fuel oil down our sewers, we are doing something, and we know we're doing it.
What was the most concrete way in which this made a difference right after the book? Was it the hearings happened, but were laws passed as a result?
Well, the Clean Water and the Clean Air Act came fairly on the heels. Especially the Clean Water Act. I think that was the first big legislation to feel the effect of Carson. But it took 10 years Maybe the bigger thing was that the wildlife system began to really take off, and people began to understand that we needed to save places. That was another of Carson's crusades, of course, was to save not only the seashore and the ocean areas, but to save wildlife refuges and to allow people to go out and see nature and therefore to love it. And her basic credo was that you can't destroy something that you love, but first you have to learn to love it. And this is the message in The Sense of Wonder. And you can see from this map there is a Rachel Carson refuge up in Maine, in Wells, Maine.
Let's see if we can get it here on the...
But
there it is.
This is a map of the refuge system of the United States, which you can see there are lots and lots of wonderful places that are trying to preserve species and are trying to give people a chance to see what real nature is all about.
Akron, Ohio, Democratic line. Good morning.
Hi. I was just wondering, since she mentioned about she wasn't an ideologue, this Miss Carson.
Right.
The question I had is, what do you think of the Earth Day environmental wackos that use a lot of this junk science to scare people? I mean, 20 years ago they said we were going to have an ice age. Now we have global warming, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, they kind of really take true environmentalists off the, you know, the face of the screen here and make them look kind of silly rather than the people who are seriously concerned about the environment.
Okay.
Well, I guess I have to say that I think sometimes the extreme points of view, when they're expressed, at least serve the purpose of getting our attention. Certainly over the long haul, you're right, however, that we need to be moderate in our thinking about what's really going on. Moderate in the sense that you don't jump to one conclusion or another ideologically. But Carson certainly was adamant that that we needed to know what we were doing a long time out, that we acted too fast, that we were a country and a society that would go for the quick fix. That was something that she thought was wrong and that would fundamentally do us in.
Powell, Wyoming, calling on the Republican line. Good morning.
Good morning.
Go right ahead, caller. You're on the air.
Hello.
Hi. You're up, but you got to mute your TV.
Yes, in just a moment. I'm hitting the wrong button now.
Okay. All right, go.
My concern is I heard the program on your companion network the other night about the biggest thing as far as immigration is concerned is overpopulation. And I wondered if the author of this book addressed that in any way.
That's a good question too. I don't know. I was writing a book about Rachel Carson and her life as a biographer. Carson didn't often address population, but I know from my own research that she was very concerned, as almost any biologist and scientist would be, couldn't help but be, with the problems of overpopulation. And while she didn't directly comment on that in her writings, she was concerned about it.
Anybody who's in Maine, we've got this, I think, on the camera here. You can see the Rachel Carson Wildlife Refuge is down in the southeastern corner of Maine, right along the seashore here. Have you must have been there.
Yes, I certainly have.
And is this? Didn't she have a home?
She had a home in Booth Bay, off the coast of Booth Bay Harbor, South Port Island, which is farther north.
Okay.
She never lived around Wells, which is where the refuge is. But this was a refuge that was already in the system that was named after her in the 70s. But she lived up in Maine during the summers, and it was Maine that was really dear to her heart. And she would work in the tide pools. I think we showed a picture of Carson looking at the tide pools earlier. And it was Maine that won her heart and where she went for refuge.
And this, by the way, I see Kennebunkport, the home of the Bush family summer home,
right there.
is right there. Our next call, Toledo, Ohio, Democratic line. Good morning.
Oh, you're on.
You're on. You're on. That's you.
Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah, I was just wondering what the lady thinks about these people fertilizing their lawns all the time, because a lot of times I go out and I got people around me that fertilize. You can't even go out and breathe the air. And I say in the last maybe 5-6 years, I've yet to see a butterfly in my neighborhood.
Wow. Well, I personally think that we need to be more responsible about what we're doing to our lawns and inevitably our groundwater, which is what's being poisoned. And the rivers of our nation are reflective of the runoff problems that we're having, and certainly that comes from misuse and overuse of chemicals.
Stillwater, Oklahoma, Republican line. Good morning.
Good morning. I was having as much fun listening to the other callers as I was listening to your conversations. I would be interested in your opinion on the overall picture that people place Rachel Carson and that type of environmental awareness in the feedback you have gotten in general as you're working on this book.
I've had wonderful letters and a wonderful reaction to bringing Carson back to our attention. She really is a name that's evoked at every Earth Day celebration, but people knew very little about her struggle and her life and just how dedicated she was to keeping our planet and our human lives healthy and wholesome. And so I've had wonderful response to the book and to the biography and to talking about Carson. And we do have a website about Carson, www.rachelcarson.org. We try to put up information not only about her but about links to topics that she considered important.
And here it is, and here's a quote, another quote in Rachel Carson's own words, quote, "The more clearly we can focus our attention on the wonders and realities of the universe about us, the less taste we shall have for destruction." Our last call for Linda Lear, biographer of Rachel Carson, comes from Monroe, Michigan, calling on the Democratic line. Good morning. Caller, are you there?
I am here. Yes, I was calling about in question of different NGOs, non-governmental organizations. For instance, the Sierra Club and the National Audubon Society. They've stated that overpopulation is such a problem, and that they're interested in eliminating, or not necessarily eliminating, but through long-term plans, definitely decreasing the population of the U.S. or the world. It seems that you can actually fit, and different scientists have said this, that you could actually fit everyone in the U.S. within the city limits of Tallahassee, Florida.
Okay.
Well, I think this is a problem, a worldwide problem, and that it's probably proper for the NGOs that are concerned about our planet. And a lead or two, but she was confident that she had it, and confident that somehow she'd find out what she was to do with it, and that something that to do with it was science.
Now, originally she thought she would simply be a writer.
Right.
And she published her first short story depending on, I read two different ages. One was age 10,
right.
One was age 11. Either one is pretty extraordinary,
right.
but...
Well, there was a wonderful magazine back then that children wrote in, the St. Louis magazine, and they had contests and children could write in. And Carson wrote early stories, and they won badges and were actually paid if they won so many badges and reached a certain level. So she published stories, mainly these were stories about her hometown in Springdale, Pennsylvania, and what she was doing out in nature with her mother, who was her constant companion, and her teacher. And later on, then she wrote, of course, about nature itself, and she was really an acclaimed nature writer.
And at some point, I guess it was in college. Something shifted.
Right. In college, she found that she was not exactly terribly imaginative.
Silent Spring, which is the book that probably made her reputation for the ages.
It did.
And can you explain, first of all, what led up to the writing of this book and what the impact of the book was?
Well, the agricultural chemical companies were big business after World War II, and DDT had been invented and created and used widely during the war, very successfully against insect pests. But after the war, it became commonly used in agriculture to kill all manner of pests, sprayed by airplane without anybody's permission over vast areas of America. And Carson became concerned that evidence was showing her that wildlife was dying. The Patuxent Refuge, which is right up the road in Largo, Maryland, Laurel, Maryland, had done a lot of work on DDT, and it showed absolutely conclusively that it was very harmful to fish and other wildlife. And they were dying by overuse, what Carson called misuse. She wasn't against pesticides.
Welcome back to Washington Journal. For about the next 40 minutes, we're joined by Linda Lear, who is...
Good morning.
Thank you very much for coming in. She's the biographer, among other things, the biographer of Rachel Carson. And if you were to describe Rachel Carson to somebody who might never have heard of her at all, or who might know vaguely who she is, how would you describe Rachel Carson?
Carson was a scientist and an environmentalist who loved nature and wanted to share that love with the public by writing about it, but also became alarmed that we had overstepped our bounds as human beings and were harming ourselves and the environment irrevocably, and wanted to warn us about that.
Okay. And I know that you think she's obviously the author of 4 books.
4 books.
And it's the view of many, including yourself, I think that some of the early books are quite good as well, and maybe even better. But the one that she's best known for, and I know we're going to try to put this under the RoboCam here and show our audience the
relationship with nature. She was first of all a nature writer and a brilliant writer, or otherwise she couldn't have made such a boring and deadly subject such as DDT palatable to the public as a bestseller. And I chose the picture because it's also by one of her best friends and colleagues here in town, Shirley Briggs, and it sort of typified the mystical sense of Carson's spirituality.
Let's take a look at when you open the book, you talk about her, and I just want to read the first paragraph for our listeners here. Most of all, it was her determination that set her apart. As a child, Rachel Louise Carson decided that she would be a writer. A literary talent, perhaps genius, and a hard-driving intelligence brought her that. But at the base of it, there was a ferocious will.
Right. This was a woman who had a sense very early on in her life that she was meant to do something important. It's rather unusual for us to meet these kinds of people. She was very single-minded, very determined that she wasn't sure exactly what her talent was going to. She was against their misuse and their overuse and their ineffective use. And so she set out to bring this kind of science to the public, to make it understandable. And the book was published in 1962 and caused an incredible ruckus because here was a woman without very many credentials in the way the world worked, telling us that the government was lying, that science was wrong, and that we should take another look at what we were doing.
We want to invite our callers, our listeners, our viewers to call in. Remind you we have 3 lines. Republicans 202-737-0002. Democrats 202-737-0001. Independents and all others 202-628-0205. I've said that Linda Lear is the biographer of Rachel Carson. Here is that biography. Rachel Carson, A Witness for Nature. Why this picture on the cover?
Well, 2 reasons. One, because Carson was a very romantic, almost mystical person, and her spiritual